I was driving home from Melbourne last night, and I was listening to a podcast that was speaking about the massive shift there seems to have been in who believes what in the last sort of 10 to 20 years, maybe slightly more than that. I look back at the 70s and I see the rock and rollers, like the lefties, who were very free speech, very small government, very leave me alone. And it was cool. Like you look at that rock and roll scene, you go, I really like that. They're against the system. And it seems that same mindset, that same thought process has completely switched, and somehow the conservatives, in my opinion, seems to have become the really cool ones in the last few years. And it's so incredible to watch just how a certain mindset held by a certain group of people seems to have been completely passed over to a different side of politics. And I was just interested to pick your brain around what you think has happened there, because it's a very strange transition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a big question, but I think part of it is that the political shifts that we're noticing, and we have arguments about every time there's an election cycle and so forth, those are always downstream from cultural trends and downstream from high intellectual trends, particularly as in the Western world, we're becoming more and more educated. Young people are spending more time in formal education, K through 12, and then a significant number of people now getting bachelor's degrees. So what's happening in the intellectual environment is exerting more control over broad cultural trends and political trends as well. So I think it's fair then to say that what we need to do to understand that phenomenon, the various flip-floppings, is what has happened in the intellectual world over the course of the last generation. And essentially, you mentioned the 1970s. So I'm a child of the 70s. That's the music of my youth. It's when I started university and then became a professor. So I've been inside this world all of my career. I think it's fair to say that the people on the left, part of the culture was a counterculture element. But at the same time, it recognized that it was drawing on a culture that was, in fact, progressive, that there were, in fact, true values, that we should be aspiring to equality for all people. And that's a universal value. And it's a real value. It's an objective value. We really believe in equality. And we think that we can figure out the problems that have come down to us from history. So we can do history objectively, learn our lessons from history, and then hopefully do our social science to figure out what we need to do to change social institutions to bring about an objectively more progressive, more egalitarian, more free society. And that was the prevailing ethos. And so to the extent that the current society of the 60s and 70s was still, maybe making progress, but maybe too slowly, right? Or that there still were a significant number of reactionary elements in society. We're counter to those people. And in some cases, we want to be in their face counter to those. And so the rebelliousness of young people takes a particular form. Now, that I think is a kind of leftism, but it was also shared by a large number of liberals and classical liberals, and even some people. I remember growing up in Canada, and the Conservative Party rebranded itself as the Progressive Conservative Party because they wanted to distance themselves from old-fashioned reactionary kinds of conservatives and so on. So I think your description of where things were in the 60s, 70s, and on into the early 80s is right. But what happened was an intellectual revolution that started in the 60s and in the 1970s. Now we call it postmodernism, right? But the label is important here because it's saying that we need to get beyond all of the assumptions, even the fundamental assumptions of the modern world. And it did come out of the left, but it did, the left is always a big tent, but this was coming out of a part of the left that was extraordinarily skeptical and cynical. And it did no longer believe that there were such things as objective values or truths, or that we can genuinely learn from history, or that there are laws of social science and we can figure out what those institutions are. And this philosophical framework that was very skeptical then said, we are committed to a certain kind of left values, but we no longer believe that we are in a society that's going to make progress. It's just going to be a constant battle between different groups that have their own subjective values. Nobody knows what's right. It's just that some groups have more power than others. But we, because of our value set, then are operating in a different kind of counterculture psychology. Right. So it's not that we just need to stick it in the face of the old reactionaries, it's that the whole society we think is corrupt. We want to overturn the entirety of the society, but we don't think this is a matter of getting people to be idealistic about values and teaching them those values, and that we're going to work together to make the world a better place. It was a cynical power play understanding of the world, and that came to dominate. Now, some of the big names here are people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and others. They sound a little old fashioned because they are a generation ago, but they were extraordinarily influential. And they then trained an entire generation of people who then became cultural leaders and professors at leading institutions. By the time we get to the 80s and on into the 90s, those ideas stop just becoming high theory. You see them infiltrating law schools, education schools, various other professional schools, and they are then training an entire generation of teachers and the next generation of professors. And then all of that then means we have a generation of people who are going to university and they are being taught a certain philosophical, skeptical, cynical, in your face, adversarial understanding of the way the world works, but they are just entering into what they see as a battle on behalf of a certain set of values. And then suddenly we're aware of everything being very different. Just let me say one more thing, and I'll kick it back to you. Earlier today, I posted a result of the HARRY study. It's Higher Education Research Institute, and it's an internal studying what's going on in higher education. And so they've done these longitudinal studies asking faculty, for example, what do you think college education or university education should be about? And so they asked professors in the 1960s, should it be about career training? Should it be about developing people into being well-rounded individuals? Should it help people encourage their self-development so they can figure out who they are and what they want to do with their lives? Should it be that we are training people to be agents of social change in society, including political change? So you have a whole array of values. Now, in the 1960s, it's true to say that there were more people on the left than there were on the right among higher education. So the content of their politics then was different, and the left was dominating in the 1960s. But set that aside, at that point, still 80% of all professors said that education should not first and foremost be about social activism. It should be about developing individuals who can think for themselves, who are going to be well-rounded individuals, who can have a productive life, and of course, also, as one of the values, be a participant in society, be a good voting citizen, and do all of the various kinds of institutions as well. So that then is to say, 80% had what we think of as kind of a traditional understanding of what education, higher education should be about. And there were only 20% of professors in the 1960s who said higher education should be essentially about training social activists. My job is to teach people who are going to go out and take charge of social institutions and political institutions and change society in the direction that I think it should go. Now, that's the late 1960s. You go to or one generation later, say the year 2010 and on into the 2010s, that survey had been done every year for 10 years. By the time we get to the year 2015, 80% of college faculty are saying, my number one job is to train social activists.
Wow.
Okay. So you put those two together, right? That then is to say, we're not training people to think really, and to think for themselves and form independent judgment and look at both sides of an argument and do historical analysis and so forth. We know what's true or what we believe to be true. We know what the values are, and education is to teach people those values so they get fired up and will go out and do something in society. And that is a huge, huge change in higher education in one generation. And that is what underlies the phenomenon that you are talking about. Suddenly, we've got a very different cultural landscape and a political landscape, but it's due to changes in the intellectual atmosphere in higher education.
Gee, it's incredible that last 10 years of the increase in
Oh,
the
yeah.
expectation that a professor should be, prioritizing social activism. I guess it's no surprise. I watch people like Charlie Kirk or Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens go into almost any well-recognized
Yes.
university or college across, whether it's Australia or America, or Candace can't even come to in Australia at the moment.
Mm.
And you see the pushback to the ideas that they're there to share. And you go, okay, as a foundation, I thought these places were set up for very different reasons, but perhaps based on the
Yeah.
description you just gave, it's in fact no surprise. Like if this
Yeah.
group of students have been educated or at least pushed towards this idea of social activism, then the idea of an opposing view is a very dangerous subject
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
just another perspective.
Yeah, I can speak to my personal experience on this. I don't know how representative those clips are that you are mentioning, but it doesn't surprise me that that's the way it is, because I do know that just among my colleagues at various universities, younger PhDs who are joining the faculty there, the new junior faculty, and they will quite proudly say that they've not read the great works in their the literary tradition. I've never read Shakespeare, I've never read Chaucer, never read anything before 1950. Right? And I'm a PhD in literature, or I'm a philosophy person, or I'm a history person, and that used to be a badge of shame, right? To admit that there are some of the great works that you have not read firsthand. And the idea then is that I don't think we need to read across the spectrum on various issues, whether it's religious or politics or any other cultural thing. I know what's true, and I'm just going to teach my narrow set of books. So it doesn't surprise anyone then that students will come out uneducated and not expecting debate, not even recognizing in many cases that there are multiple interpretations. So, but I recall the various universities I went to when I was an undergraduate and then grad school, and then my first couple of teaching positions. It used to be common, right, that the Christian evangelists would come around, literally get up on their soapbox and start preaching, and people enjoyed it, right? They would have arguments and discussions about biblical passages and this, that, and the other thing, and then the Republicans would have their speakers who would come around. The Democrats, the Marxists would be there. I even heard a fascist once at my undergraduate institution. And people would say, this is serious stuff, but at least we should listen to these people and sharpen our own argument. So the expectation is that all of the major positions are going to be out there, that students are going to be exposed to them, and you want them to learn how to think through all of them and make up their own mind. That, to the extent that that has gone away, has been a disaster.
It's interesting to hear you say you saw one fascist. I think anyone who
Mhm.
disagrees with what the mainstream idea of what you've been taught to believe is now labeled a fascist. So some students have seen
Yeah.
hundreds over the last 12 months.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's part of the debasement of the political vocabulary. If you don't know how to argue, we all know this when we're in the schoolyard, when we're in kids, and we get frustrated, then we just start throwing words out at people. The worst insults that we can imagine. It doesn't matter if they are true or not. But if everybody's a racist, or everybody's a fascist, or everybody's a sexist, then those words are debased, and it says a lot more about the person who's just casually throwing them out there. You're not dealing with a sophisticated or educated person.
Yeah, and yet it's such a common go-to. I mean, I noticed this more than ever during the COVID period here in Australia. I know
Mm,
Canada and Australia seem to have quite a similar approach with the way that they dealt with it from a government perspective. And I remember anyone who had legitimate questions about the way that the government were going about mandating, whether it was vaccines or lockdowns or whatever, was very quickly labeled an anti-vaxxer and a skeptic. And you're right, like I saw some lovely people who were smart people, very reasonable, lovely people who, had questions about the way that it was being pursued. And the idea of just pigeonholing them so you didn't have to deal with any of their points as reasonable. It certainly seems like a good tactic if you don't want to have an actual honest conversation.
I think that's a very good example, and it's kind of pointing up about the purpose of language and how language is being used. So, if we say in the prior generation, we think that language is about teaching individuals to carve up the world and categorize the world and be able to understand the way the world works in increasingly sophisticated ways. So learning how to do grammar and logic and carefully define your terms and present a case for your position. And at the same time, recognizing that a lot of these things are very complicated. So you expect that people will have different ways of conceptualizing the world, and you have to learn how to navigate your vocabulary and their vocabulary and find common ground and be willing to change your mind and so on. So that then is to say that is to think of language as a tool of cognition for figuring out the way the world really works, and that we then are going to develop norms of civility and conversation to the extent that we're trying to do this socially, if we're going to have conversations and debates and specialized institutions. But this is where the skepticism becomes important, because if you have a philosophical movement, and the postmoderns are the clearest example of this, where you don't think language ever tells it or maps onto reality, that reality is just not knowable to us. Instead, all we have is these subjective values and subjective frameworks and subjective narratives, and nobody's narratives are better than anybody else's. Then it doesn't make sense to think about language as trying to figure out the way the world is. It also then doesn't make sense that we should try to use language cooperatively, jointly, to try to communicate with each other. So the postmoderns quite forthrightly reconceptualize what language is, and it just becomes a weapon. Right? It's just one more tool that you use when you're trying to overpower other people. So if you find you use language in a certain way and that gets people to shut up, right, then that's a success. Or if you can use language in a way that pushes people's emotional buttons, and we know that people, when they get emotional, they don't think clearly, and that sabotages their cognitive process. So if you learn how to push their emotional buttons with language, or if you learn that there are certain logical techniques, like attacking people personally, right, or appealing to various authorities, or muddying the water in various ways, and those also sabotage someone else's cognitive process, then that's fair game. Right? Language for you is a weapon against your enemy, and any use of rhetoric that disarms or weakens your enemy is something that you want to do, rather than saying that all of those things are sins to be avoided because they get in the way of clear thinking and good communication.
Yeah. So, like with that perspective applied, like on a postmodernist, how are they even attempting to find truth, or is it something that's completely irrelevant? Like the idea of truth is just out of reach, regardless of how well you research, how well you look. It's not something you can actually find for sure. I guess that's probably the problem so many postmodernists have with like the religious organization, or maybe one of many problems that they could point to is the fact that it seems quite dogmatic and, ironically, they seem to share so many of the traits that they apparently stand against, and yet. That's one thing that I struggle to sort of wrap my head around, because the idea of using words so effectively to disarm your opposition's ideas, but not in a way to actually point towards or help discover truth, it almost seems like an irony.
Yeah. Well, irony is a favored word of postmoderns, because they will, often say that they're taking an ironic stance. Right? So they'll use certain words, but at the same time, you are backing away from the literal use of those words, because we don't want to go down this philosophical road, but there is something self-contradictory about saying, the truth is that there is no truth, right? Or it really is the case that we don't know what's really out there. Right. So that how do you formulate those things without immediate self-contradiction? So a kind of ironic stance is often a fallback position for for those attracted to postmodernism. But I think maybe the best analogy is if you think about a courtroom where rhetoric becomes important. So someone's on trial for something or other. We have a prosecution and a defense, or a plaintiff and a defendant, and maybe we have a jury and we have a judge. And in one sense, this is a powerful institution, right? So something very bad is going to happen to someone, or something very bad has happened already to someone, and we're trying to sort out what we're going to do in response to that badness. But we're familiar with the kind of two kinds of lawyers, right? There's one kind of lawyer who says, look, there are facts of the matter here. Something happened, and we really need to use all of the best cognitive tools available to figure out what the truth is, what the facts are, and to put them together in a story that best describes what happened in reality. And so that commitment to facts and objectivity and truth is fundamental to that kind of lawyer. And much of our Western legal system is built upon that cognitive commitment to facts and truth. But also, the idea here is that we are striving for justice. And we all know that sometimes justice fails and we don't get things right. But really, there is such a thing as right and wrong, good and bad. There are good people, there are bad people, there are evil people, there are victims. So all of these normative distinctions are important and valid. And what we really want to do is figure out the truth so that we can do justice. We can really find out who the bad guys are and punish them appropriately, whatever that is, or who has been victimized and compensate the victim appropriately. And that is what my commitment is. And that is then to say that that kind of lawyer is going into the practice of law with a philosophical commitment. I believe in facts, in truth, in logic. I believe in the civil procedures of the law, and I believe in justice. And those regulative standards then guide his or her activities in the court. But we also know, of course, that there's a whole other species of lawyer who will say, cynically, that's all crap. That's all nonsense, right? There is no truth. And courtrooms are not about figuring out truth and justice. Courtrooms are about who can tell the better story, the sexier story, right? Who can, in some cases, pull the wool over the eyes of the jury. And I can use all kinds of rhetorical tricks in order to mislead them down this road or obscure various things that the other side came up with. And the issue here is not whether I'm saying things that are true or not, but what can I get away with, right? Before the other lawyer objects, before the judge strikes me down. And so I'm just using language as a tool of power. I want my side to win. It doesn't matter if my side has truth and justice on its side. It's all about power. And the language I'm using in the courtroom is just to get the power of this institution on my side and against the other side. That's the difference between kind of the mainstream of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years and what the postmoderns and some of their allies are attacking.
Yeah, well, that was one of the most interesting things, I think, from having an armchair view of the American election period over the last 6 to 12 months was maybe the blessing and the curse, depending on what side of politics you stand on, is that like every moment of you speaking is now captured. And so the idea of a politician, regardless of what side they're on, being able to get up there and say something and then immediately change their mind depending on the audience or the people that they're speaking to, and seemingly having no accountability to the things they once said is something that I think I definitely struggled with. And I mean, it's interesting. I'm 37 now, and perhaps needing to be careful that you don't fall into ideas of just well-trained thoughts and the assumption that you know how things are and moving towards cynicism. But you look at politics and you can see where the idea that politicians are just liars comes from. Because I mean, I saw about, I was watching a Kamala Harris clip where she was talking about gun ownership at one stage, and you know how we've got every right to be able to take guns. And then 6 months later, she's a proud gun owner. And people I remember just reading people saying, hang on a second, like, where do we stand? And I mean, I'm completely open to the idea that, and naturally, I change my mind from time to time, and I hope I always will my beliefs actually change. I can be public and open about that. But the idea that there's 15 in a short space of time makes you question,
Yeah.
whether you believe anything you're saying, or as you say, you're just trying to win an argument or win an election in this case.
Yeah. I think all of this carries over to, or applies in lots of different cultural spheres, but I think you're quite right to say the debasement of political discussion in a democracy, as exemplified by the last perhaps couple of elections, is an illustration of that. I think a couple of things I think are going on. I think one thing is politicians have always done this.
Yeah.
That's true. So part of it just might be what you're talking about is now that we all have the cameras and everything is instantly recorded and beamed around the world, that we are as consumers of politics, so to speak, right? The people watching what the politicians are saying, we have better access to catching them when they are doing this sort of thing. And so, in some sense, we can be surprised that it happens as often as it does. I think aside, it's not simply a technical issue about our being better able to detect it when it happens, but I think that the expectation that politicians will tell the truth has declined as well over the course of the last generation. It's been encouraged precisely by the intellectual trends. So rather than saying we are going to hold scientists and journalists and politicians to a higher standard, those standards themselves have been debased. And so, to the extent that those standards have been debased, the next generation of politicians say, well, why should I even try? And so it becomes a vicious cycle rather than a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, you see it through not only politics, but like a lot of mainstream institutions. I know you've probably had a front row seat in the academic world through college, university.
Hmm.
But I mean, whether you're a newspaper, a news outlet, a politician, the level of distrust that the public has over, I mean, I can only speak from the last 10 years when I've been paying more attention,
Hmm.
seems to have dropped dramatically even in that time. And it's been a real power struggle here in
Yeah.
Australia. Currently, we're in a really interesting time. I think we've got quite a like a so-called progressive government at the moment, our Labor government, and there's been a number of things that they've attempted to pass that the Australian population have voted against, but the most current one is like a misinformation bill. So the idea that the way they're floating it is, at the moment, we're trying to ban social media for
Yeah.
kids up to the age of 16. And I mean, I've spoken to a few parents, and on the surface, like everything, you hear that and you go, oh, okay, it makes sense. Like, it's taking a lot of their time. There's pretty clear graphs that represent the drop in mental health between their use of technology and, a couple of years down the track. But then Elon Musk posted about it. He's gone back and forth with our prime minister, just speaking about how it seems like a backdoor attempt to control what information
Hmm.
the general population has access to. And I mean,
Yeah.
if there's one thing that those institutions, for a large part, seem to have an issue with, it's the fact that alternative ideas are being expressed that maybe make more sense than
Yeah.
what these so-called trusted institutions are telling us to believe.
Yeah, no, I think the decline in the trust of institutions is a healthy thing because it is so well deserved. And so, one of the great things about social media, for all of its, we're all going up the learning curve, including young people, about the risks as well as the benefits of all of these tools. But one of the benefits has been exposing just, the outright cynicism, the outright lying by so many people in powerful, trusted institutions. And you're quite right to say it's not only politics; it's also in journalism and the idea of higher education as an institution of truth seeking. It's almost hard to say that with a straight face in many departments of higher education. I don't want to be too cynical. I think in many universities around the world, beautiful, wonderful, truth-seeking things are occurring. The natural sciences are still by and large healthy. Many of the professional schools and so on, but there are outright intellectual sewers, so to speak, in almost every university around the world. So, I'll just kick it back to you about where you want to take the conversation next on this
Yeah, well,
theme.
I actually had a question that I've sort of pinned in my mind about something you said at the outset of the conversation. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were speaking about postmodernists. But you mentioned that history is something that we can't learn from necessarily. This wasn't your words, obviously, but the example of the postmodernists, or
Yes.
as I
Yes.
said, correct me if I'm wrong. It's an interesting thing, because obviously we look back at history and we do say we learn from our mistakes. And I can say time and time again in my own life, I'll see mistakes that I've made in the past and I'll aim to correct it. And I'll have the best intentions. And yet 6 months later, an opportunity comes up for me to correct the mistake, and I fall into the same trap. And it's a very small example, but one thing that I'm interested about is there's no doubt we can learn from history, surely. Like we see the errors of our way, but whether it's on an individual level or on like a world scale, there does seem to be a trend that we go back towards, like there's a spectrum between capitalism and communism, for example, or the spectrum between that liberal and that fascist style government. And it's sort of hard to wrestle with, because you say that sure, we learn from history, but the truth is we do seem to stumble upon the same mistakes time and time again. Like, is that just a generational thing, in the fact that so many of us don't read back beyond, say, the 1950s, like the young PhDs at some of these things? Or what is going on there, would you say?
I think that's a complex question. I mean, you're right to point out that at the individual level, it can be hard for us to sort out what we did in our lives and remember it accurately and figure out why we did what we did. And if the results were good, to try to turn that into a habit. And if the results were bad, to change whatever thinking process or experiment or bad habit that led us to do that. So that's always an ongoing and difficult project for us as human beings. And it does require that one has good cognitive habits and that you develop those cognitive habits, but it also requires a value commitment. You believe that improvement, progress, self-development is possible. So you have to have a personal philosophy to do all of that. But then it becomes even more difficult when we start doing some of these things socially, because if it's you and I together are trying to figure out what happened and what we are going to do and what went wrong and what went right, then not only does each of us individually have to do all of that, but we have to do it together with a lot of information exchange and so on. So it becomes a difficult problem. And you scale that up to 10 people, 100 people. So all of the issues, just to take one example about, from the business world, it's one thing to be a solo practitioner. You just have to manage yourself. As soon as you start hiring other people, the principles of management for running a 10-person organization, it's already daunting for many of us to scale that up to a 1,000 person organization or 10,000 and international with all of the cultural differences. These are huge challenges. So one of the issues is just the scaling up. And that does require, to the extent that we scale up, that we have, again, good cognitive habits. But here we're talking about being able to think abstractly in terms of more and more general principles. And that is a learned skill, and it's a difficult learned skill, and something that requires ongoing practice. But I think also another part of your question that you mentioned along the way is that it is generational. So I think that when we talk about we learning from history, part of it is that every 25 or 30 years, the we is not the same we, right? And so the point then is that one generation comes along and it gets its education. It learns how its culture works. It learns certain ideas about religion and science and politics, and it, in many cases, is innovating and doing a bunch of new things. And so it adopts things from the previous generation and then moves things in a certain generation. But it's important to remember that every new generation, they're all born tabula rasa. They don't know any of that. And so they learn from their parents. They learn from sports. They learn from schooling. And they learn from their own experiences and playing with their friends and so on. But I think to the extent then that the older generation fails to educate effectively, we will expect that the younger generation will be prone to committing more of the same mistakes that previous generations made. So figuring out how, this is what good parenting and good schooling is all about, to pass on the hard-won lessons of history, both good and bad, and then also to teach young people how to assess the lessons of history, and then also to be able to exercise good judgment about what new experiments and what innovations to introduce. That's really hard work. And so to the extent that you have a debased education system, I think we would expect the next generation to seem to be going backwards and committing a lot of the same mistakes of earlier generations. So I think also, though, that part of it is, I think philosophy is difficult. I'm a philosopher by training. Politics is difficult. Religion is difficult. I think even if we do figure things out, I think there are a number of philosophical positions, broadly speaking, that it's easy to make a case for it. It's easy to make a case, for example, for a secular humanist outlook on life. It's easy to make a basic case for a religious conservative outlook on life. It's easy to make a case for, especially for young people who have psychological damage in various ways, for a cynical, skeptical, adversarial outlook on life. And so I think there are philosophical frameworks that every young generation of people, significant numbers of them, will first hear of that framework, and it will seem reasonable to them. And since life is short and they want to get on with their own lives, they will adopt that framework. So my expectation, though, is that sociologically, we should expect that every generation, there's always going to be representatives of kind of all of the major philosophical outlooks that are there. And what happens that determines the direction of that society for that generation is going to depend on which of those frameworks has the best arguments in that generation and uses the institutions of learning and the institutions of culture the best to convince the most number of people in that generation. But there's nothing fixed about it and nothing deterministic about it. And so even if we are progressive, and I think we have been progressive for the last 500 years or so, in many cases it is going to be 2 steps forward, a step back, or 3 steps forward, 2 steps sideways, and so forth. So it's a work in progress, to use a cliche.
For sure. I mean, it doesn't seem to matter what scene you're involved in, whether it's a sporting team or like a religion, politics again. There's no shortage of things that we can disagree on. And so even if we go into it with use religion for an example, like at my church, you might say the core tenets are, okay, people believed in Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And okay, that's like a pretty fundamental part of what it means to call yourself a Christian. And yet you go a little further down the line, you go, okay, well, there's you got a Baptist church and you've got a Pentecostal church, and they've split based on the fact that there's slight variations in what you believe about certain scripture. And I mean, that split just has gone on for hundreds of years and through thousands of different denominations. And it is interesting that even when you do have some core tenets that all of you would agree on, you can still disagree on the minute details to such an extent that you're not going to meet with those people on a Sunday. You're going to go and start your own congregation. It seems like it's a difficult world to navigate when there's so much to disagree on.
Well, yeah, that's right. But it's better to have those difficulties than to be in a world where you're not allowed to try to navigate those difficulties or think about those difficulties. So we know that there are societies that are self-stultifying. You mentioned dogmatism earlier, where the dogmatic philosophy becomes dominant, and then it institutionalizes itself in all of the major cultural organizations, and then people just don't think anymore, and kids don't learn the thinking skills, and so that becomes a stagnant culture. So in one sense, if we want to have an open society, we will have to accept the messiness that goes with it, including having to navigate hundreds and hundreds of issues. And our best hope is training enough young people to have the cognitive skills and the emotional resilience to be able to do that more or less successfully.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up cognitive skills again, because it was something you said earlier, and I like the phrase. When you say cognitive skills, like when it comes to our thinking, what are you referring to? How would you actually develop cognitive skills that are going to help you navigate some of this terrain?
Yeah. Well, let's try. I don't know. Let's try a parenting example. So, uh, suppose you're a parent, right? And we'll just talk about style. So, if you're a parent of young, you've got your young kids. You're basically tired all of the time. So we'll start there, right? So maybe you work, right? And you work hard, and then you get home, and you love your family and you want to spend time with your family, but kids also are exhausting, right? You have to look after your house and blah blah blah. And so kids are kids, and there are all these bundles of energies, and you've got 4, 6, and 8 year olds, and all of them have a million questions about everything. All of them want to do things their own way. So what we then have, so to speak, is a mini society, that we call a family. But if we think about just the standard parenting styles that we are familiar with, I mean, there's one kind of parent who will very patiently say, the important thing here is my kids need to grow up with some independence, with an active mind. I want them to be curious. I want them to be emotionally resilient. So I'm going to have to tolerate, right, my kid asking why, right, all of the time, and try as much as I can, even when I'm tired, to answer as many of those questions so the kid can understand, to the level of the kid's ability, what's going on, what the evidence is, what the objections are, what the uncertainties are, and so forth. And that sometimes there's going to be that I don't know what the answer is. And then I'm going to want the kid to say, well, okay, my parents are not the know-all authorities. Maybe I'll just need to live in uncertainty for a while, or try some experiments to see whatever. And sometimes things are going to work out and sometimes they are not. And that's okay. It's okay to cry sometimes, and it's okay to be happy, right, various times. And so dealing with the emotions and talking through them, and so on. So we can talk about the principles behind that, about if you think that's the right model of parenting, how to do that well, and so forth. But we can also, though, imagine, we all know that there are parents who say, in this situation, my kid starts asking why, the kid's challenging my authority. I'm the parent here, and kids should be listening to what I say. I already told the kid 20 times this is the right way to do this, or what the answer to that question is. And sometimes kids should just be quiet. They should shut up and give us some peace and quiet. Right? And so I'm going to then develop a more authoritarian parenting style. Here are the right answers. These are the truths. When your father or mother speaks, they should only have to say it one time. You agree with that and you do what they say. You don't challenge your parents. And by and large, the answers are worked out. Here's the recipe, the things that you're supposed to do, the things that you are not supposed to do. And I train kids habitually to follow the recipe in life. Now, already we've got two very different parenting styles, right? It's just in this very small unit that we call the family. But we can imagine those being blown up to broader social philosophies and political philosophies, and that's part of what happens. But we also know there's another, parenting style where we say, I'm a parent and I recognize I don't have my life together. I'm a mess, right? The only reason
That's the category I'm in.
Right, the only reason I have I have kids is that I got drunk at the bar and I hooked up with this woman, right? Right, and so forth. And I don't particularly want to be a parent, and I'm not the right person to give advice. And so I'm, so to speak, a non-parent, and so I avoid parenting as much as possible. And maybe I put a roof over the kid's head and send them to school in some minimalist parent, but really I'm just a dropout. And so I'm, so to speak, I'm just going to put this in quotation marks, I'm an anarchist dropout, right, kind of a parent. And the kids are just going to have to work it out themselves. And so, in effect, my own personal not having my act together becomes the rule for that society, and then kids kind of have to learn the society is chaotic, and who knows when dad's going to come home drunk or drop out or be there
Sure.
and be reliable or not be reliable or blow up emotionally or whatever. And that's the philosophical world in which the kid learns. Now, the cognitive style, and this is the question that you were asking about, of those three kids is going to be very different. If you can imagine a kid raised in a dogmatic authoritarian household from age 0 to age 18 versus one that's raised in the dropout anarchist household from age 0 to 18. And by then, your mental way of thinking about things and emotionally reacting things is largely set, versus a kid who's had good hands-on parent who taught kids how to think and handle their emotions and develop good habits and so on.
Yeah, I think I threw myself into that final category of parenting too early. Then you got to the real dark stuff. I said,
I
"Oh, I'll
just
throw
made it
myself
worse
under
and
the
worse.
bus."
Yeah, I took the stereotype and ran with it.
No, I mean, to steal your example, sorry to jump in.
Oh, that's
And my
fine.
mum would be very open about this. My granddad, he was 85 or 83 when he passed away. This is 10 years ago now. He was perhaps that old school classic dad. Like, he was that authoritarian parent. It's like, children, my mum, he would have told you this. My mum will tell you this. It was very much, hey, children should be seen and not heard. You listen to what I say when I say it. And it's really interesting to see. My mum's one of three kids. There's her and two brothers. My mum's a real rule follower. Like, if someone says you do this, that's what my mum does. And
Okay.
I think to a fault sometimes, and she wouldn't mind me sharing this, but I often look back at my granddad, Harry, and I go, I can kind of see the origins of that, because he was the kind of guy that, especially when he was young and big and she was little, he was an authority, not just in how he spoke, but in how he held himself. And
Yeah.
so the idea of arguing back to that came with serious consequences. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Let me
I see
throw
her
it.
now, and
Yeah.
we often clash, because I would say that I'm maybe the opposite of that. I'll sort of dip my toes in the water of a little bit naughty from time to time just to see what happens. And she laughs at me. She goes, "I can't believe how differently you and I are in temperament." Like,
Yeah.
so it is interesting, even from, well, I guess that's that 30-year period again, 30 years between my granddad, my mum, and myself. There's some real changes in the way that, the way you were influenced as a kid has changed the way you approach life as an adult.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Let me throw one other example. That's to talk about in a family model, and I think we can all relate to that. But kind of how this scales up into broader cultural models, and not yet to go into politics per se. So I'm from Canada originally, and now I'm living in the States. That's where mostly I've spent my time. So one thing I've noticed, what I've done, teaching and lecturing around the world, is that there are cultural differences about something as simple as crossing the street. So, for example, the things that's standard for Canada and the United States is you come to a street, and suppose there are traffic lights there, and the light is red, right? And you will look at the red light and it says so you don't cross. But pretty much what you do is you will say, well, how busy is the street? And you'll look both ways. And if there are no cars coming in either direction, it's safe to cross. You'll cross the street, even though it's a red light, and that's fine, right? So that's just kind of a standard practice here. Now, my wife is from Argentina, so I spent a certain amount of time in Latin America. And one of the things that struck me was when I went to Latin America was how initially dangerous it was for me to cross the street, because down there, right, this is a slight overstatement, traffic signals have no meaning, right, whatsoever. Right? And so it's like, yes, there is the traffic signal. And part of it is a certain amount of anarchy. Oh, you're telling me I can't cross the street here, or I have to just, in order to give the finger, I'm just going to cross whenever I want and whenever I feel like. But also, part of the ethos is in North America, if you're a driver and you see a pedestrian crossing the street, you'll slow down and accommodate, let that person go, even if you have the right of way. That does not apply in Latin America. Right? You take your life into your hands, and you get no quarter, right, from drivers down there. So there's an aggressiveness, right, in play there. Now, then we can say that this is in part that Latin America has a certain cultural style, a certain attitude with respect to rules, and part of it is that rules we try to flout them whenever we can, but we think that we're in a more adversarial culture. Me versus you, and that comes out in the driving style. Whereas in North America, if someone's having a bad day, then yeah, we will say they have road rage. But by and large, right, it's a much more benevolent culture. And with respect to rules, yeah, rules are in place, but you can break the rules when it suits your judgment. But I remember contrasting that with a couple of times I've been a visiting professor in Poland, which is emerging from the first generation after communism. And communism is very much a dogmatic, rule following institution. And to draw this right back to the example of crossing the street, I can remember coming back from a restaurant late at night with some colleagues who were Polish academics. The streets are completely empty, right? Everybody is home. Right? And we come to a street and we're going to cross the street to get to our hotel, but there's a red light and there's the little red man, right, who's saying, don't walk up at this point here. And so I'm doing the North American thing. I'm looking both ways. It's a short street. No cars are coming. Let's cross. All of my Polish colleagues are standing there and they absolutely will not cross the street, right, at that point because the sign is red. And I remember joking with them about this. There's no one coming. Let's cross the street. And they say, no, very seriously. Right? We cannot cross the street. Right? And these are older people who grew up under communism. So the rule is the rule. And the idea of individual judgment or flouting the rule is just culturally alien. So just another working example with the family example.
It's a great example. I mean, it's amazing you don't even have to cross cultures to be able to experience it. I live in a coastal town, little place called Point Lonsdale, about an hour and a half outside of Melbourne. And if you go into a shop here with no shoes on, people just assume you're a surfer.
Yeah.
And then you take that same approach in the middle of Melbourne. You go into a shop with no shoes on, people assume you're a drug addict. It's a really weird dynamic to see, like even with 150 kilometers difference.
Oh yeah.
The rules bend and change. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. How have you dealt with the I guess the criticism, for lack of a better description, that some of the big colleges have received over the last few years with reference to what we were speaking about earlier, like that seeming like increase in the approach to social activism and teaching around that? Because I think sometimes, and I've fallen into this trap, you throw the baby out with the bathwater in whatever field it is that you're looking at, when really within each of these institutions are like a lot of very reasonable people who have got the best intentions to help the students.
Yeah, for sure. I think this goes across much of the political spectrum, if we focus on that, and much of the religious spectrum. I think there are people on the left, people on the right, people who are liberal, conservative, I would say moderate socialists, who are nonetheless still committed to the liberal arts ideal as it was developed in the culture. You want to develop a well-rounded person. You're going to trust that ultimately each student has to make up his or her own mind. So you have to train their reasonable faculty to understand all of the big issues are controversial, and people need to know both or all sides of a controversial. And particularly if we are in an innovative culture, at the front end, the cutting edge, so to speak, there's always going to be things that we don't know and lots of debate. And so we are, despite political differences, in many cases, despite religious differences, jointly trying to educate the next generation of students to understand and then become contributors to that ongoing cultural work. But then at the same time, we do know that there are dogmatists, and a significant number of them. Now, in sort of mainstream universities in our generation, most of the dogmatists are on the left, and they are coming out of the far left. There are a significant number of more religiously oriented institutions, and there's a lot of dogmatists there, but they're typically coming out of the political right and obviously a certain religious perspective. So Partly, I want to say there is a demographic shift, and we should be aware of the demographic shift. And I don't like the demographic shift that we have more dogmatists than we should in self-regarding institutions. At the same time, I'm not totally pessimistic about this because I recognize from history that philosophical waves occur, that we go through sometimes eras of dogmatism, sometimes eras of skepticism, sometimes eras of liberalism, and it depends on which of the brightest intellects in each generation or two have the best arguments or the most interesting new theories and so forth. So, in one sense, it's natural to say that, okay, philosophy and closely related disciplines, when I was a student, were in a very skeptical and cynical place. A lot of the leading theories and paradigms had just failed, and nobody knew what to do or what was going to replace them with. And so, a lot of people then just take a leap of faith or dogmatically say, well, I'm going to go for social activism and just do my own thing. And we are in the either peak social activist phase right now, or perhaps I hope we're on the downside of that. And that's part of the natural evolution because what happens is a better generation of intellectuals come along and new paradigms and better new theories that solve the problems of the old ones come along and people get excited about that. But then at the same time, students say, look, I don't want to just learn social activism and to hate other people because they are the wrong race or because they're rich or whatever. I want to get along with people and build a better society. So students, stay away from the social activist courses, the angry, indoctrinating courses. Donors learn to the extent that governments are funding these institutions. The politicians learn that they're just funding dogmatists, and so they start to put correctives in place and so on. So, as messy as the last 10 years have been, at the same time, I do see signs of health there, just because it takes a while for people to regroup who actually want to do education. And there are new institutions coming into existence. There are reform movements inside the academy. There are brand new colleges and universities that are being formed saying, look, we're going to get back to education. We're not going to do woke crap and we're not going to do indoctrination anymore. And at the same time, parents and students themselves are learning about some of the horror stories about what's actually going on in universities. So they are becoming savvier consumers, so to speak, choosing more carefully which universities they send their kids to, which departments at which universities they send their kids to, supporting the new institutions, seeking other avenues, and so on. So there are corrective and innovative entrepreneurial ventures coming along. And I'm optimistic that in 10 years, we will be looking back, I think, from a more healthy, cautiously optimistic perspective.
Yeah. Speaking of those new institutions, just before I let you go, I don't know if we were recording when I said it, but last night I heard you and Jordan Peterson speaking about the fact that 2 of your 8 classes or 2 of your 5 classes
2
on
of the
Peterson
5,
Academy
yes.
have been released. That's
Yes.
a pretty exciting prospect. It seems like a big project that's being undertaken, but is that like a main focus of yours at the moment? Are you still speaking? Are you still teaching in colleges in America or in Canada, or where are you at with that right now?
Yeah, well, yes and no. No, the Peterson Academy connection has been just great. They were trying to figure out, partly for all of the politicization issues that you are worried about, how can we create an institution that's actually going to teach all of the controversies in religion and politics and psychology and philosophy and so on. But how also can we do lower cost education so that students are not spending tens of thousands, or in some cases over $100,000 or $200,000 to go to traditional universities, and those don't fit for everyone. So low cost, nonetheless high quality, and then also the technological materials that we have available. We can bring world class lecturers in who are area experts and have them teach a course in their area of expertise. it's a certain amount of time commitment for that person to go to the studio in Miami, teach the course. But once it's done, then you have first-rate production values, and it's timeless, and it can be viewed all around the world. So there was a lot of very careful strategic thinking that went into that. So I'm happy to be a part of it. And then just in their first month, they had 35,000 paying students. So it's already
Wow.
it's a good sized university by by anyone's standard. So I think that's a great experiment. It is for me a part-time focus. I've got other lecturing that I do at other institutions. I've in transition from my current university in this year, 2024, where I've been teaching for some years. So uh, there's no short answer to your question. I've got
Yeah.
I think three or four big projects going on. Peterson Academy, and as you mentioned, there's three more courses in the pipeline. They're in post production right now, but I'm actively monitoring how that experiment is going, and we're talking about the future as well. So all I can say is
Amazing.
just stay tuned.
We will. We will. Stephen, hey, really appreciate you making the time. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Yeah, good fun. Yeah, lots of great questions, and we had some laughs along the way, even though we're talking about very serious stuff.